con la programación del 8º Encuentro Nacional de Catalogadores y tenemos el agrado de presentar la conferencia magistral de Virtual International Authority File, VIAF, Within the Bibliographic Ecosystem, dada por Nathan Putnam, de OCLC. Al final de la exposición tendremos unos minutos para realizar preguntas en vivo al orador. Nathan Putnam es el director de calidad de metadatos de OCLC y supervisa los equipos de especialistas que trabajan en la integridad y calidad de los datos para la base de datos bibliográfica, la base de conocimiento y el registro de WorldCat. Tiene 20 años de experiencia en catalogación, trabajando en múltiples bibliotecas académicas de Estados Unidos como catalogador y administrador, y disfruta discutiendo las tendencias y problemas de catalogación con la comunidad de metadatos en general. Muchas gracias, Nathan.
Gracias. Thank you very much as well. Let me start to share my screen.
Sí. Comienza tu exposición.
All right. Well, thank you very much. As I was just introduced, I'm Nathan Putnam, and I'm the Director of Metadata Quality for OCLC up in Dublin, Ohio, in the United States. I do have a cataloging background. I was a cataloger for many years, primarily cataloging DVDs, audiovisual materials, and various special formats for that. And I have seen the evolution of MARC data going into linked data, which will be a prominent theme within this presentation, as VIAF is really going to play an integral role into that transition from a record-based system into a linked data RDF kind of system. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you how VIAF has and will play into that transition. And so without further ado, I will begin the presentation. So the Virtual International Authority File, known as VIAF, is a service that provides libraries and library users with access to an array of international authority files. VIAF contributors supply authority data that VIAF matches, links, and then clusters together. The service allows researchers to identify names, locations, works, and expressions, while also preserving the regional preferences for language, spelling, and script, a very key concept for VIAF. There are more than 50 VIAF contributors from over 30 countries, and VIAF is governed by the VIAF Council, which includes representatives from the contributor organization and provides guidance on the policies, practices, and operations of VIAF. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about a history and give an overview of VIAF. For those of you less familiar with it, what is all involved with the cluster records and how those come together. It will also include some statistics about the data that's in VIAF. Follow that, I'm going to talk about potential uses for VIAF data, both within a MARC record-based environment and also in the linked data RDF environment. And finally, I'm going to transition that into kind of the future of VIAF as its data is being used in an entity infrastructure project that OCLC is working on. So with that, the Virtual International Authority File. Discussions about having a common international authority file started in the late 1990s, approximately 30 years ago, 20 to 30 years ago. After a series of failed attempts on a unique common authority file, a new idea was thought of, and this had the goal of linking existing national authorities. This would allow the benefits of a common file without requiring a large investment of time and expense in the process. In April of 1998, the United States' Library of Congress, the German National Library, or the Deutsche Nationalbibliothek, and OCLC wanted to test linking of each other's authority records for personal names as a proof of concept, just to see if it would actually work out the way that they were thinking it would. In August of 2003, the VIAF Consortium was formed by a written agreement by the Library of Congress, the German National Library, and OCLC. And this was all announced during IFLA's, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, their conference in Berlin, Germany. Just a couple of years later, the National Library of France, or the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, joined the consortium. So after 2007, the four organizations, they had all begun to assume the roles of principals. They all had joint responsibility for VIAF, and the three contributing libraries, LC, G&D, and BNF, these libraries were contributing authority and bibliographic content. OCLC, in the meantime, supported the software and the infrastructure. As the popularity of VIAF grew and the proof of concept really took off and people were understanding what the potential was with VIAF, additional organizations joined the consortium as contributors. They provided source files and expertise, which advanced the state of VIAF. Because of the success of the proof of concept, the principals and the contributors sought a suitable long-term organizational arrangement for VIAF. So after considering many different options, the principals and contributors agreed to transition VIAF to OCLC, which was completed in April of 2021. So this means that as an OCLC service, we provide the software and the infrastructure for this. I'll talk a little bit about the governance in a moment. So today, VIAF combines multiple name authority files from LAM institutions. So these are the libraries, archives, and museums. And these authority files are combined into a single OCLC-hosted name authority service. The goal of this service, of course, is to lower cost and increase the utility of library authority files by matching and linking widely used authority files and making that information available online. And while it is an OCLC service, it is a built-in cooperation with national libraries and the partners who contribute data. VIAF is governed by the VIAF Council, which provides guidance on the policies, practices, and operation of VIAF. This includes developing policies on the eligibility and selection of new VIAF contributors. The Council also advises OCLC on VIAF's services, features, and supported data formats, and it promotes the effective and appropriate use of VIAF. OCLC maintains the hosting, software, and the data. Every VIAF contributor may appoint a voting representative to the VIAF Council, and then OCLC also appoints one liaison. The council is headed by an elected chair, and this person transitions into the role after serving a year-long term as chair-elect. And then the transition usually takes place during an annual VIAF Council meeting that prior to the pandemic had been scheduled along with the IFLA World Library and Congress Information Congress. The last two sessions, I believe, have been virtual and have taken place sometime in the fall. So for those of you who have not searched VIAF or not familiar with it, I wanted to take a look at how VIAF is actually set up. And we're going to go through a search for the English writer Charlotte Bronte. So I have the opening screen, the search heading screen of VIAF displaying in the slide. And in the search box, I have different options from which to select. So I can select specific headings that I would like to search, such as personal or corporate names. I can search for works and expressions. And there are other items like geographics, corporate bodies. very typical library searching mechanisms. I can also choose whether I want to search all of VIAF or just the file of a specific contributor, such as the Library of Congress or the National Library of Argentina. In this case, I am going to leave both options on their defaults, and I'm going to search for the headings within all of VIAF. The search box auto-populates suggestions as I begin to type. And like many of the integrated library systems out there, my search terms come up and I can choose from a list of items. And fortunately, Charlotte Bronte is the first one in the list. From here, I've received all the possible headings for Charlotte Bronte or those that she is associated with, such as biographies or works that she has written. The items currently here represent a cluster of authority records, All of the records from the VIAF contributors are grouped together into a cluster using machine algorithms. The flags next to each heading represent the country that used the form of the heading that data supplied. So this one record is all for Charlotte Bronte. You can see it's number 1, and they're all linked together. You can see the different flags that are available here, and you can see the Argentinian flag right above this red dot under the CH of Charlotte. And this indicates, of course, that the Biblioteca Nacional Moreno contributed to this cluster along with all of the other flags you see represented here. So when I click on any of those links, let me go back. When I click on any of the links here, they all link to the same place. They link to the VIAF cluster record. And this is bringing together select headings from all of the records that make up the cluster. Zooming in on the cluster record, you can see the options that are available for you to actually see. And again, this is bringing in all of the data from all of the records from the contributors. So in addition to the preferred form of names, which also include like alternates and relative names. So if you're speaking Mark, it's fields 100, 400, and 500. In addition to those, you can easily find pieces of related information. So the works that this person is associated with, co-authors that may have existed with this person, areas of publication statistics, and then selected publishers. So the bibliographic data that is also incorporated into VIAF contains this information. And then also about this person. So for Charlotte Bronte, this includes gender, country of association, field of activity, occupation, and the language that she's known to have written in. Finally, the last 2 sections, which are record views and the history of VIAF ID, these are metadata about the VIAF cluster itself. So the record view allows users to view the record in a variety of formats and actually download or copy and paste. And they may view the record, the cluster record, as Mark 21, XML, in an RDF, or JSON. The history section then details when the records were added or removed from the cluster. From this history, I can go in and look and see that Argentina's National Library, their record was added to the cluster in September of 2019. Now, I just want to point out this wheel thing right here on the back, which is part of the cluster record. And I'm going to zoom in on it, and just so that you can take a closer look at it. So another feature then of the cluster view is an infographic that connects the same form of names between VIAF records. So not every library or institution uses the same form of names. And what I mean by that is the most common for Charlotte is Bronte, Charlotte, and then it has her birth year and her death year. Some libraries leave that off. The dates off. Some library include information such as English poet, English novelist, but the most common form is the one that you saw before at the very top, Bronte, Charlotte, birth year, death year. So what's nice about this infographic is that there's a quick visual clue as to the number of source records that share the same form of heading, and in this case for Charlotte Bronte. I've selected the dot next to the Argentinian flag right here, and you can see the National Library's control number. And you can follow then the lines to see what other countries use that exact same form. So if I come down here, here's the United States. The Library of Congress is also using this form of name, but some of these other flags down here are using a different form. This is interactive, so if you were live on the site and hovering or clicking on these different circles, the orange lines in the middle would change. All right, so finally, clicking on the VIAF cluster record allows the user to view the source record. So here's the Argentinian National Library's source record, which includes the record number. We saw this number in the slide before. And this record goes on for a while, so all the information for Charlotte Bronte down below. If I click on authority source record, up here at the top, I'm linked directly to the source record. So regardless if this is the National Library of Argentina, or the Library of Congress, the German National Library, wherever the source data comes from, we really strive to provide a link directly to that data in case you as a cataloger were interested in it. Making sure that all of these stay linked up is a large part of the infrastructure that OCLC plays in providing the data to you. So now that we've taken a look at what VIAF is, hopefully you have an idea about that, at least for person entities. Let's take a look at some statistics that show the size and scope of the data. So VIAF is quite large, and it does come from a variety of data sources. As of last September, so last month, 57 institutions were contributing to records to VIAF. This turns into 173 million bibliographic records, 87 million authority records, and then 35 million cluster records. So remember that the cluster records combine the information from the bibliographic and the authority records, bringing together that single view of the contributor data that had all the headings in it, and like the history down at the bottom, the metadata down at the bottom. So lots of numbers on the screen. The exact numbers aren't what's important. Instead, what I want you to do is notice the large numbers at the top. This represents the numbers of records or clusters that have been added between 2020 and 2021. So going from left to right, over 4 million records were added for the top 10 languages of cataloging that are represented in VIAF. This and then the other languages that are represented resulted in an addition of over 1.8 million clusters in this year period. Note that there was a decrease of approximately 41,000 in the number of all authority records, specifically for those with persons and titles. And these two numbers down here are negative. So VIAF is an active authority file, and changes are occurring quite frequently. And that's the point that I wanted to make with this slide. It's not really a static database. We have data coming in and things changing, being updated as needed. And so to point out the reduction in personal and title authorities, this is due to a cleanup project at one of the contributor libraries. So the German National Library is hoping to improve its data, and by doing that, they've actually deleted some of the records that they contribute to VIAF. So when you have a chance to look closer at the slide, you'll notice that the overall numbers over here for Germany, the number of records contributed by them went down by approximately 875,000. Finally, before we get into more of the usage of VIAF, I wanted to bring up the guidelines document. So this document is mainly for those contributing records to VIAF. Those are contributors and library sources. But you as a cataloger may be interested in knowing the guidelines around contribution. This document gives a short description of what is needed to successfully participate in VIAF, and it includes what records should be submitted, basic requirements for records, where VIAF looks for information, how you can influence the clustering if you notice something's not quite right, and we may have incorrectly clustered something, and common problems when submitting data. Of course, and it goes without saying, but the more complete and comprehensive a record is, and not to mention it needs to be structurally accurate, the more information can be used to cluster the data together. An issue that VIAF does have, and this is problematic at any library who's even just using a normal authority file, is when it runs into sparse data. The more we as catalogers can do on individual authority records within our own infrastructures, the more we can facilitate future automation activities as we move away from MARC records. And you'll start to see what I mean by that as we go into the now second half of the presentation. So let's look at how VIAF is being used. I want to cover this both from the MARC record base and also in a linked data RDF. After this, we're going to look at who is using VIAF and other linked data information based on studies done by the OCLC research staff. So apologies for the less technical in the crowd. I'm going to get a little technical here, but hopefully I'm explaining it at a level that makes sense to everybody. So one challenge that we have is over the course of the last decade or so, we have found that we need to differentiate real world objects from descriptions about real world objects. So the distinction is often very difficult for catalogers to make. And I will admit that when this was first brought to me a decade or so ago, I also had trouble understanding the difference. So it takes some time to get useful. But fortunately, there's documentation and tools available that is making this understanding easier and the differentiation easier. So the goal of distinguishing between authority records and real-world objects is to align our library practices with those of the semantic web. While catalogers may have difficulties understanding this, it is fairly simple to code, which I'm going to show you within the MARC record. So in a simplistic way of looking at this, the authority record contains the description of a thing. So on the left, I have the authority record from the United States Library of Congress that's describing information about Charlotte Bronte. It has years associated with her, her areas of practice, such as novels, poets. She was a governess, she's a female, and she's primarily dealing with English. So on the right, then, we have an image of Charlotte Bronte, who of course, died in 1855, but we still know that she is a real world person. She existed. Now what we can do is we can establish uniform resource identifiers. So if you've heard of URIs, they function like a URL, like you put in your web browser. We can establish URIs for both the description and the actual person. So when the URIs are acted upon by a machine, the coding will tell the machine what it is working with, and it can perform actions such as clustering descriptions separate from clustering real world objects and keeping that information separate. So how does this play out in a MARC record? So I have some basic metadata for Charlotte Bronte's work, Jane Eyre. I grayed out the MARC information so we can definitely just focus on the metadata. So in addition to containing manifestation of the work, it also includes critical commentary of the work. And this is noted by having an editor. We are in our 4th edition. Clearly, Charlotte Bronte did not write multiple editions of Jane Eyre as a fiction work. And it's also a Norton critical edition. So now, while all of this information is extremely useful to a user who's looking for an item or a cataloger that's describing a resource, a machine is actually going to have a difficult time parsing out the information and the pieces of data that are all in here. This becomes relevant if we want to convert this information to linked data, or we want to cluster this information with other similar information like we've done in the VIAF cluster record. So starting a few years ago, the MARC standard was updated to include these URIs, those uniform resource indicators, for both description, which is pointing to the authority record, and for the real world object. At the very top of the screen, under the heading for Charlotte Bronte, 2 URIs have been added. The first URI, right next to the red pointer, is in a MARC subfield 0 and points to the United States Library of Congress authority record. In the second URI, in subfield 1, this points to the VIAF cluster record and is being repeated, and is being treated as a real world object. Hold on. Bear with me for the break there. All right, so additional URIs were added also at the bottom of the record. We have 3 altogether. This field is relatively new. It's field 758, and it allows the cataloger to add a resource identifier. And so from the MARC documentation, field 758 contains an identifier, so that's what the URI is, for the resource that is either the resource described in the bibliographic record or anything to what is related to the resource described. So resources are identified, may include, but are not limited to, Ferber works, if you're familiar with FRBR, Ferber, the Ferber works, expressions, manifestations, and items. And this field does not prescribe a particular content standard, and that's because it's fairly new. So right now, pretty much anything can be put into these fields as long as it's structured in some way. Knowing this now, we can infer what was added to this record in these fields. So the first 758 right here contains the authority record and real world object for the work Jane Eyre. So the authority record for Jane Eyre, and then the real world object, the VIAF link for Jane Eyre. The second 58 then contains the URI to the clustered record within WorldCat. So if you've ever searched at worldcat.org, you know that we will bring similar editions together. We'll present one at the beginning, but if you want to see additional ones underneath it, you can click View Editions and Formats. This cluster of records has a work ID associated with it. And so what I wanted to do here was associate the critical edition work with the one here. So that's what this WorldCat is covering. So some of you catalogers are thinking, what's up? At best, this seems like added clutter to the MARC record, and worse, some may see the blue hyperlinks and expect to click on them and have them actually go somewhere that would be kind of friendly to the average user. So, but it is important to remember that these URIs are mostly for machine processing. Having them in the MARC record prior to clustering or conversion to linked data enables much simpler processing, and in some cases can automate clustering when the work URIs are found in multiple MARC records. So in theory, every Jane Eyre record, regardless of when it was published, could have the cluster of the work available to it. or I'm sure there's a VIAF ID also. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the word. The VIAF work ID could be in any MARC record for the book Jane Eyre, regardless of when it was published. All right, so who's using this linked data and what are they doing with it? So getting out of the MARC view, I do want to refocus on this VIAF and VIAF, the uses of VIAF in various infrastructures. So during the past 7 years, OCLC Research conducted several surveys on the implementation of various linked data tasks and uses. Building upon the interests of members of the OCLC Research Library Partners Metadata Managers Focus Group, OCLC Research conducted the first international linked data survey for implementers between the 7th of July and the 15th of August back in 2014. This followed updates to the original survey, which were conducted in 2015 and again in 2018. Interested persons can access the data directly on the OCLC Research linked pages and through several articles by Karen Smith Yoshimura, who conducted the survey and published the results. So a wide range of institutions participated in the surveys, and these included research libraries, national libraries, research institutions, library networks, government libraries, service providers, public libraries, museums, and a few who had identified themselves as others. While research libraries continue to have the highest number of responders, you can see growth as indicated with the red bars, interest in other groups like the national libraries, the research institution, and government institutions. Even on the lower end of the responder spectrum, public libraries and museums have also seen a small growth. So assuming a continued high turnout for survey responses, this trend is likely to continue as the linked data ecosystem comes into its own and is adopted by many types of libraries. So despite the number of institutions answering the questions on how long they have had a linked data project in service, the number of projects and the time they have remained active continue to grow. 75% of linked data projects and services described in 2018 are in production, which is slightly higher than the 67 reported in 2015. 40% of the linked data projects and services described in 2018 have been in production for 4 or more years. So you can see that linked data projects are really coming into their own and maturing as time goes on. So here are the top 8 linked data implementations that are most used according to the 2018 survey. And so most used in this context is measured by the average number of requests per day, with all services reporting over 100,000 requests per day. All 8 services have also been in production for over 4 years. Looking at the linked data sources, which are consumed by these infrastructures, here are the top 10 linked data sources that the 2018 survey respondents responded to, and in a comparison to the 2015 survey. So it should be noted that the number of respondents to this question were almost the same, 69 in 2018 and 68 in 2015. 6 of the 10 sources dropped between 2015 and 2018, while the other 4 grew. The largest change was in Wikidata. So you can see in 2015, the gray line ends around here, just under 10%, and the red line jumps it up to just over 40% in the 2018 survey. And even though VIAF dropped between the 2 surveys, so if we look at VIAF, it went from 60% down to just over 50%, it's still relatively high. It's ranked pretty high, coming in second after the Library of Congress's id.loc.gov service. So just to kind of point out, because I think Wikidata and linked data are really playing together in the library world, at least within the United States. Here's some of the services that did start using Wikidata. This is brought up because it is a reasonable assumption that if the survey were to be conducted again, the use of Wikidata is likely to have increased even further. In some cases, those listed here were also listed previously as having linked data infrastructures. All right. Taking the last turn of the presentation, I want to look at kind of the future of entity management systems, potential, and the incorporation of VIAF data into these systems. So with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in the United States, OCLC is working on a shared and centralized entity management infrastructure for library linked data. It is expected that this will be completed in December of 2021, and this infrastructure will include authoritative descriptions of several types of entities, including works and persons. These entities will be enhanced and managed both by the library community and OCLC. Connections to other external vocabularies and the incorporation of VIAF will place library collections in a broader context across the web. Simply put, taking the data out of the MARC record and putting it into the semantic web so that end users can find it much easier. We're breaking out of the silos of MARC data and various things like that. So while the entity infrastructure that I described is OCLC is working on, the same kind of processes and techniques could be used and have been used in other infrastructures as well. And I really want to focus on what is happening within OCLC's entity infrastructure in part of building VIAF and how VIAF is playing an integral role in that. Person entities is one of two entities that the infrastructure is focusing on. And as I said, the other one was work entities. So for persons, we are extracting the wealth of data that is available in that VIAF cluster record. We are combining the data with data from Wikidata to add greater depth to the entity description. So for this project, VIAF is the source of label, instance of, which would equal person, birth and death dates, and the variety of external identifiers that are available within the VIAF cluster record. We're combining this with Wikidata data as the source for description and name aliases, which we refer to as also known as. So for a cataloger, if you're in, the preferred form may not have a middle name, or the preferred form may be a shortened version of a name. The also known as would include the fuller forms of name. So I've taken the pieces from the VIAF XML cluster record, and this is for Charlotte Bronte, and displayed them here for you, just little snippets of it. You can see that the breakdown of the data being in the collection, the wiki identifier, this Q127332, is what will help pull in the description and the also known as from Wikidata. To note, the LC, the Library of Congress, so there's their identifier, and here's again the Wikidata identifier. These identifiers are represented by just a number and not a URL. So there are pros and cons to choosing whether to use just the number or to use that URL, that URI, are outside of the presentation, of the scope of this presentation. So I don't want to dig down into that, but kind of where this ended up is that when VIAF was being built, remember this is 20 plus years ago, the number was selected as the identifier, which is why you see it here and not as a URL. When MARC best practices by the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, both in the United States, were created, URLs So that the links, the blue links, were selected for the identifier. And this was just kind of a matter of practice. All right. So finally, how does this all work together? I have a view of the entity infrastructure. It's a little bit small. Like I said, the system is still being built. And when I went to go get the entity view of Charlotte Bronte, unfortunately, I was unable to log in. And that is just part of the nature of the system being actively worked on at this time. So in the meantime, I used a screenshot of our entity view from a previous presentation for this Polish photographer right here. And you can see the VIAF data, the VIAF ID is prominently linked right here. If you clicked on that link, you'd end up going to the VIAF cluster record. And other identifiers, the Wikidata identifier in ISNI, if you're familiar with that, Library of Congress name authority file, and other identifiers are all available in this record. So the entity infrastructure is bringing these identifiers together so that regardless of what system you're in or what identifier you're using, you know that this Polish photographer in this system is the same as the Polish photographer represented in Wikidata or VIAF or the National Library of Argentina, just because of these identifiers that were there. And that all started out as that vision from 25, 30 years ago of how we can link these pieces of data all together. So I hope very much that you found this presentation interesting and insightful. We did start with the history and current status, and we looked at how VIAF is being used and how it continues to be used going into the future with entity infrastructures. And with that, I would like to thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Agradecemos la valiosa y generosa presencia de Nathan Putnam y del VIAF y OCLC, también desde su presentación. Ahora tendremos unos minutos para realizar preguntas a Nathan y luego los esperamos para compartir el bloque número 5 de conferencias. Muchas gracias.